that, we're now going to move on to our to going through it. So we'll start with the first line of the Gemara, as you saw. You can see that on one line of Gemara, there's a lot of things written about it. ואמר רבי יהושע בן לוי, נשים חייבות בארבעה כוסות הללו, שאף הן היו באותו הנס. If you've never heard this before, it's a very famous Gemara, and it comes up in a number of different places, as you probably saw by reading the Rashbam and the Tosfot. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, the reason why women are obligated in drinking 4 cups of wine, okay, in other words, he's saying they are obligated, and the reason is because they were also included in the miracle. Okay, so now we're going to have to understand what exactly does this mean. So the first question is, why is there even a question if women are obligated? So normally, women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot, and this would be a time-bound mitzvah because it's the night of the Seder, right? And it's done particularly on this night, and therefore you would think they would be exempt. Tosfot points out something very interesting. In the first Tosfot that you read, it says, V'i lav hay taima. If it weren't for this reason, lo hayu chayavot. In other words, what he says is women are obligated because they were also part of the miracle. That assumes that if they weren't part of the miracle, whatever that means, which is the second part, but if they weren't part of the miracle, then they would have been exempt. So the question is, why would they have been exempt? So the obvious answer is because it's a time-bound commandment. It has to be done that night. But when you read between the lines of Tosfot saying, it's very interesting. He says here, if it were not for this reason, ilav haytaima, not for this reason, lo ayu chayavot. Why? Mishum denashim pturot mimitzvot aseh shazman gama, af al gav de arba'a kosot de Rabbanan. He says because women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot, even though 4 cups of wine is only rabbinic, ke'en de'oraita tikun. What does that mean? It means when the rabbis established this law, they established it with all the criteria of a Torah law, which means that if there's some rabbinic law, it's going to have all the criteria of a Torah law, which means that if a Torah law, they'd be exempt, then they're also going to be exempt from a rabbinic law. Now, there's something underlying what Tosfot says, and that is based on an opinion that Rashi quotes somewhere else, not in our Sugiyot, but Rashi elsewhere points out that when they talk about time-bound commandments, that women are exempt from time-bound commandments, Rashi suggests that maybe it's only in Torah law, and that when it comes to rabbinic laws, maybe there's no exemption for women of time-bound commandments, which is very interesting because, again, this is a whole other topic for a whole other shiur as to why women are exempt from time-bound commandments. But what's interesting about the Rashi there is that Rashi says it's possible that women are only exempt from time-bound Torah commandments. So when Tosfot says they would have been exempt because it's time-bound, even though it's rabbinic, he's countering what Rashi says elsewhere. So it's just an interesting side point about a whole different topic, which is women exempt from time-bound mitzvah. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about the machloket between the Rashbam and Tosfot about how to understand this line, she'af hen hayu b'oto hanes. So let's go through the words literally. Af means even. Even they were in the same miracle. So if you read it that way, you're going to see that the Rashbam really doesn't sound like the simple reading, because what does the Rashbam say? Da'amar b'mesechet sota, b'schar nashim tzidkaniyot shehayu ba'oto hador nig'alu. Quotes the Gemara in Sota, which quotes a midrash about the nashim tzidkaniyot, that the people were redeemed in Egypt because of the reward of the nashim tzidkaniyot. That what did they do? They seduced their husbands under a tree. It's based on a verse in Shir HaShirim, Tachad hatapuach orartich. That they enticed the men under the tree because the men were tired from work. They were killing the children. They said, why bring children into the world, right? This is, in the Holocaust, similar thing, right? Some people said, let's bring more children. Some people said, why should we have children, right? The men didn't want to. The women saved us because they said we can't stop having children. And now we're going to learn that the same phrase, and this is what makes it famous because it appears in many situations, also by reading Megillah, and also also by Hanukkah. Women have to light Hanukkah candles. Okay, many times they fulfill their obligation together with their husbands. Some people do light, some people don't light, but they are part of the obligation. So now we have 3 commandments here, 3 mitzvot. Notice the common denominator. They're all rabbinic. Okay, they're all Rabbanit. right? Because Megillah and Hanukkah didn't exist in the time of the Torah. And when it comes to these things, we're going to say, well, by Megillah, it was Esther. She was the motivator, right? She was the main character. And in Hanukkah, doesn't say here, but they say they connect it to Yehudit. Okay, now if you think about the Hanukkah story, she wasn't the main character. She's talked about in Sefer HaChashmonaim. She's a bit of a side character, but she is a woman who is part of the story and has a role to play. So the way the Rashbam interestingly understands Afkana Yubotones is that the women were players. They were leaders. They were very important players. Were it not for them, the stories would never have happened the way they did, which means, so now it's very interesting. So women theoretically aren't really obligated, but because we don't, now, if you think about it, if the women were leaders, it's very hard to exclude them from the celebration of the victory because they help bring about the victory. So because of that, women are included, okay? Now, there's a bit of, I asked here, is there a bit of a difference between the role of women, right? If I had to ask you, which woman would you think would be, a leader, you would say Esther, right? And maybe by Hanukkah, you could say Yehudit played a central role. But if I ask most of you what Yehudit did, you probably don't even know the story, right? It's not as famous a story. She's not as well known. In any case, they, right, that's not for right now, but they were, maybe it was a woman who ran the thing. Nashim Tzidkaniyot that encouraged their husbands to have children, not so clear that they're, right, it almost seems like what you would call a kvetch, right? That the Rashbam has this theory and he kind of has to find some connection of, right? Because really, who's the main person? And it's very obvious that Moshe is the main hero in the story. Maybe you could say Miriam and Shifra and Puah, and there are some women that were central, but it's not the same kind of thing. So that's one weakness with the Rashbam. Okay, we're going to go on though and now look at Tosfot. So Tosfot says, Perish Rashbam, Shal Yadam Nigalu. So he quotes the Rashbam. V'chein b'Megillah Yedei Esther, u'b'Chanukah Yedei Yehudit. He mentions Yehudit here. It's interesting. They don't mention, he doesn't quote what the connection is to Pesach. But he says v'kasher, but it's very difficult. Number one, and he's going to give a list of problems with the Rashbam's interpretation. Kasher, de'af mashma she'enan ikar. This is very similar, if you remember, to the first Tosfot we saw in the first week, where he's using grammatical or linguistic proofs. He says the word af, even means mashma she'enan ikar, that they weren't central. The Rashbam is the women were totally central. He's saying they're not really central. Ve'od. Furthermore, he quotes the Yerushalmi. Okay, that's the Palestinian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud. Garis sha'af hein hayu ba'oto safek. Notice the change of word. Not ba'oto anes, ba'oto safek. What's safek? Safek means it was doubtful whether they were going to survive or not. They almost also didn't make it. Mashma ba'ota sakana de lashmid laharog ula'abed. He takes this language from the Megillah, right? They were also going to be destroyed. And because of that, he says we're going to involve them because it's all about, right? What's the idea? The point of Arba Kosot is to thank God for redeeming us. It's not a matter of who was the leader and who led the revolution or the getting out of Egypt. It's a matter of who was going to be destroyed and who is saved and who should now praise God. You can't leave women out of this. They went through the same experience as the men did. There's even sources that say that they suffered more because one of the things the Egyptians did was they made the men do women's labor and the women did men's labor. And that was obviously harder labor and they had other suffering issues. But in any case, they suffered at least as much as the men did, if not maybe more. But okay, so now if we have the Rashbam, we have the Tosfot. Tosfot has a lot of good proofs. Af sounds to match it. The Yerushalmi's version definitely seems to prove the Tosfot over the Rashbam. The Rashbam we like because he's talking about women heroes, right? That's always the heroine, we'd always be happy when we see women are central characters. But the fact is, if you think about it, the mitzvah of doing the 4 cups of wine, what should it matter if the women were leaders or the women were going to, right? It's not like we value leaders yes, we value leaders, but because we value leaders, we're going to include women in a mitzvah. It doesn't seem to connect as well. But the Tosfot, there's one major problem with the Tosfot, and Tosfot is smart. He addresses it, he brings it up, and he kind of, puts it aside. He said, you might say, Hada amrina de pturot misukah. If you take this theory, so what do you have now? You have this issue now that they're now pturot misukah. Now, sukkah, women don't have to sit in a sukkah. But yet, if you want to say they were part of the miracle of Sukkot, what was the miracle? Right? Because God put them in Sukkot, they were also saved. So now they have to say, wait, that's different. That is a Torah law. That's different. He now starts to say that this can only be used on rabbinic, when you get to rabbinic mitzvot, and not when it comes to Torah law. And therefore, he says it's an aseh d'oraita. That's why he says it's not going to be relevant for Chag Sukkot. Okay, but that's a question that you can really ask on him. Okay, now and this question is really a question that leads to other questions, which is why. And if you take Tosfot, then you have an answer. But if you don't accept Tosfot, then you have a question, which is, why are women commanded? Why do we say Afenu Yubotone specifically by the 4 cups? Why don't we say it by matzah? What about maror? What about all the mitzvot of the night? So matzah and maror, there's a separate drasha. I'm pretty sure it came up in the daf. Yeah, we learned it in the daf. It talked about, because you can't eat chametz, then you also are obligated in matzah. Anyone who can't eat chametz is going to be obligated in matzah, and they connect. And matzah and maror are eaten together, so that gets you into matzah and maror. So that's another possible reason as to why you don't need Afenu Yobotones. The Beit Yosef actually says that we learn from here, it's not just for the 4 cups, it's also for Hallel. And Hallel, first of all, is connected with the 4 cups somewhat, and it's also all the other mitzvot from the night. Okay, so that's another way to see this. Okay, so that it's not just the 4 cups, it's also all the other mitzvot that are not matzah and maror, which they're included for other reasons. I wanted to just suggest another reason, going back to the first question we asked about why you would have thought women would be exempt. Another possibility, by the way, besides thinking, oh, it's maybe time bound and that's why. But another possible reason connects with what we saw last week, which is just like it's not women's way to recline, maybe it wasn't women's way to drink. And maybe drinking wine is just not relevant to them. And especially as we're going to see in the next section, that maybe one of the reasons for drinking wine is it's a sign of freedom. Might not be that a free woman in those days drank wine as a way of showing freedom. And maybe you would think that she's not part of it, and therefore they have to include her. Okay, so now I want to move on to the second part. So I'm going to give you a very short intro. We're going to start with a statement of Rav Yehuda. Okay, I'm going to, actually, I can pull it up from here. Second. Actually, it's in the first, we'll start it from right here. Okay, so the next part of the Gemara, Rav Yehuda is going to make a statement in the name of Shmuel. He's going to say 4 things. The first one I'm just going to teach you, and the other ones I'm going to send you to learn on your own. The first one is Arba'a kosot halalu. Okay, he's going to start getting into details of the 4 cups. Tzarich sheyehe bahen kedei mizigat kos yafeh. Okay, what does this mean? I told you that they diluted the wine. So it means that you have to have the amount of concentrate that you can use, the amount that would fill a nice cup of wine, okay, that you would use as a respectable cup of wine. Okay, so we're going to see that that means that you're going to fill it up so that you have 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Although it seems like some people might think here, we just mean you need the amount that would be used if you diluted it with water. That's how much you need. Okay, that's the first part I want to tell you about. The reef, as I said, I forgot to put the reef on the sheet, so we're going to send it separately. Maggie's sending it in the chat. Why I'm bringing the reef, okay, the reef is a commentary he was from Morocco in the year around 1000 he lived, the 11th century, and he has, it looks like the pages of the Gemara. You can find it in the back of a regular Gemara if you have a Gemara with the commentaries in it, and he basically just cuts out all the stuff that's Haggadah, okay? And all he has is the halachic parts of the Gemara. And usually he just quotes the Gemara. Once in a while, he adds some extra words, but you'll see that his version of the Gemara was different than our version. Now, this is very important. In those days, they used to copy things by hand, and you end up with different types of, different texts. It doesn't always say the same thing in his text and our text. And that's going to be very relevant, okay? Because he has a very big difference to our text and his. And with that, I'm going to send you to Chavruta. What you're going to see is some extreme examples. And from the Gemara, from extreme examples, you can often learn more things about what the conceptual idea about the mitzvah is by taking extremes. Okay, I want one more point before you go to Chavruta, which is there's a few questions that are kind of long and complicated. I put them as advanced questions. So questions 5 and 6 are only if you have extra time. Skip first to number 7 and then go back to 5 and 6 if you have the time. Okay, if not, it's stuff that we'll go over in class and it's a little more complicated. So I didn't want you to get stuck on it. Okay, so and as always, you do not have to finish everything in the Chavruta. And I like to give extra so that people who, number 1, have extra time and can go through it. Number 2, you want to go through things after class. I want to make this class as wide reaching as possible. So people who can get through the stuff, great. People who can't, it's totally fine. The idea is to just get your feet wet in it, start to learn it on your own, and we will do the rest together.